Absalom, Absalom by William Faulkner. This book consists of 9 chapters and is 471 pages long. The following material appears on the dust jacket of the book. In Absalom, Absalom, first published in 1936, William Faulkner tells the story of Thomas Sutpen, the enigmatic stranger who came to Jefferson in the early 1830s with a French architect and a band of wild Haitian Negroes to wrest his fabulous mansion out of the muddy bottoms of the North Mississippi wilderness. He was a man, Faulkner said, who wanted sons, and the sons destroyed him. His tragedy left its impress not only on those who knew him personally, but also on those, like Quentin Compson, who are haunted even into the 20th century by Sutpen's legacy of ruthlessness and his single-minded disregard of the human community. Many readers consider Absalom, Absalom to be William Faulkner's finest achievement. William Faulkner, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, was born in New Albany, Mississippi on September 25, 1897. He published his first book, The Marble Faun, a collection of poems, in 1924. But it is as a literary chronicler of life in the Deep South, particularly in the fictional Yoknapatawpha County, the setting for several of his novels, that he is most highly regarded, in such novels as Sanctuary, 1931, The Hamlet, 1940, The Town, 1957, The Mansion, 1959, he explored the full range of post-Civil War Southern life, focusing both on the personal histories of his characters, especially members of the Snopes family, and on the moral uncertainties of an increasingly dissolute society. His other novels include The Sound and the Fury, 1929, As I Lay Dying, 1930, Light in August, 1932, Absalom, Absalom, 1936, The Unvanquished, 1938, Intruder in the Dust, 1948, Requiem for a Nun, 1951, A Fable, 1954, and The Reivers, 1962. For the latter 2 books, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. He also wrote several volumes of short stories, as well as collections of poems and essays. In combining the use of symbolism with a stream of consciousness technique, he created a new approach to the writing of fiction. In 1949, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. William Faulkner died in Byhalia, Mississippi on July 6, 1962. Publisher's Note. This new edition of Absalom, Absalom is the first corrected version of the novel to appear since the book was originally published in 1936. The text is based on a comparison under the direction of Noel Polk of the first edition, Faulkner's holograph manuscript, the typesetting copy, and the working galley proofs. Chapter 1. From a little after 2 o'clock until almost sundown of the long, still, hot, weary, dead September afternoon, they sat in what Miss Coldfield still called the office, because her father had called it that, a dim, hot, airless room with the blinds all closed and fastened for 43 summers, because when she was a girl, someone had believed that light and moving air carried heat, and that dark was always cooler, and which, as the sun shone fuller and fuller on that side of the house, became latticed with yellow slashes full of dust motes, which Quentin thought of as being flecks of the dead old dried paint itself, blown inward from the scaling blinds, as wind might have blown them. There was a wisteria vine blooming for the second time that summer on a wooden trellis before one window, into which sparrows came now and then in random gusts, making a dry, vivid, dusty sound before going away. and opposite Quentin, Miss Coldfield, in the eternal black which she had worn for 43 years now, whether for sister, father, or not husband, none knew, sitting so bolt upright in the straight hard chair that was so tall for her that her legs hung straight and rigid, as if she had iron shin bones and ankles, clear of the floor, with that air of impotent and static rage like children's feet, and talking in that grim, haggard, amazed voice, until at last listening would renege, and hearing sense self-confound, and the long-dead object of her impotent yet indomitable frustration would appear, as though by outraged recapitulation evoked, quite inattentive and harmless, out of the biding and dreamy and victorious dust. Her voice would not cease, it would just vanish. There would be the dim, coffin-smelling gloom, sweet and oversweet with the twice-bloomed wisteria against the outer wall, by the savage, quiet September sun, impacted, distilled, and hyper-distilled, into which came now and then the loud, cloudy flutter of the sparrows, like a flat, limber stick whipped by an idle boy, and the rank smell of female old flesh, long embattled in virginity, while the wan, haggard face watched him above the faint triangle of lace at wrists and throat, from the too-tall chair in which she resembled a crucified child, and the voice not ceasing but vanishing into and then out of the long intervals like a stream, a trickle running from patch to patch of dried sand, and the ghost mused with shadowy docility as if it were the voice which he haunted, where a more fortunate one would have had a house. Out of quiet thunderclap he would abrupt, man, horse, demon, upon a scene peaceful and decorous as a school prize watercolor, faint sulphur reek still in hair, clothes, and beard, with, grouped behind him, his band of wild niggers like beasts, half tamed to walk upright like men, in attitudes wild and reposed and manacled. Among them the French architect with his air grim, haggard, and tatter-ran. Immobile, bearded, and hand palm-lifted, the horseman sat. Behind him the wild blacks, and the captive architect huddled quietly, carrying, in bloodless paradox, the shovels and picks and axes of peaceful conquest. Then in the long unamaze, Quentin seemed to watch them overrun suddenly the 100 square miles of tranquil and astonished earth, and drag house and formal gardens violently out of the soundless nothing, and clap them down like cards upon a table beneath the up-palm immobile and pontific, creating the Sutpens 100, the Be Sutpens 100, like the olden time, Be Light. Then hearing would reconcile, and he would seem to listen to two separate Quentins now, the Quentin Compson preparing for Harvard in the South, the deep South dead since 1865 and peopled with garrulous, outraged, baffled ghosts, listening, having to listen, to one of the ghosts which had refused to lie still even longer than most had, telling him about old ghost times. And the Quentin Compson who was still too young to deserve yet to be a ghost, but nevertheless having to be one for all that, since he was born and bred in the deep South the same as she was. The two separate Quentins now talking to one another in the long silence of not people in not language, like this. It seems that this demon, his name was Sutpen, Colonel Sutpen, who came out of nowhere and without warning upon the land with a band of strange niggers and built a plantation, tore violently a plantation, Miss Rosa Coldfield says, tore violently, and married her sister Ellen, and begot a son and a daughter which without gentleness begot, Miss Rosa Coldfield says, without gentleness, which should have been the jewels of his pride and the shield and comfort of his old age, only they destroyed him or something, or he destroyed them or something, and died. Without regret, Miss Rosa Coldfield says, save by her, yes, save by her, and by Quentin Compson, because you are going away to attend the college at Harvard, they tell me, she said, so I don't imagine you will ever come back here and settle down as a country lawyer in a little town like Jefferson, since northern people have already seen to it that there is little left in the South for a young man. So maybe you will enter the literary profession, as so many Southern gentlemen and gentlewomen, too, are doing now, and maybe someday you will remember this and write about it. You will be married then, I expect, and perhaps your wife will want a new gown or a new chair for the house, and you can write this and submit it to the magazines. Perhaps you will even remember kindly then the old woman who made you spend a whole afternoon sitting indoors and listening while she talked about people and events you were fortunate enough to escape yourself when you wanted to be out among young friends of your own age. Yes'm, Quentin said, only she don't mean that, he thought. It's because she wants it told. It was still early then. He had yet in his pocket the note which he had received by the hand of a small Negro boy just before noon, asking him to call and see her, the quaint, stiffly formal request which was actually a summons out of another world almost, the queer, archaic sheet of ancient good notepaper written over with the neat, faded, cramped script which, due to his astonishment at the request from a woman 3 times his age, and whom he had known all his life without having exchanged 100 words with her, or perhaps to the fact that he was only 20 years old, he did not recognize as revealing a character cold, implacable, and even ruthless. He obeyed it immediately after the noon meal, walking the half-mile between his home and hers, through the dry, dusty heat of early September, and so into the house. It, too, somehow smaller than its actual size. It was of 2 stories, unpainted and a little shabby, yet with an air, a quality of grim endurance, as though, like her, it had been created to fit into and complement a world in all ways a little smaller than the one in which it found itself, where, in the gloom of the shuttered hallway, whose air was even hotter than outside, as if there were prisoned in it like a tomb all the suspiration of slow, heat-laden time which had recurred during the 43 years, the small figure in black, which did not even rustle, the wan triangle of lace at wrists and throat, the dim face looking at him with an expression speculative, urgent, and intent, waited to invite him in. It's because she wants it told, he thought, so that people whom she will never see, and whose names she will never hear, and who have never heard her name nor seen her face, will read it and know at last why God let us lose the war, that only through the blood of our men and the tears of our women could he stay this demon and efface his name and lineage from the earth. Then almost immediately he decided that neither was this the reason why she had sent the note, and sending it, why to him, since if she had merely wanted it told, written, or even printed, she would not have needed to call in anybody, a woman who, even in his, Quentin's, father's youth, had already established, even if not affirmed, herself as the town's and the county's poetess laureate, by issuing to the stern and meager subscription list of that county newspaper poems, ode, eulogy, and epitaph, out of some bitter and implacable reserve of undefeat, and these from a woman whose family martial background, as both town and county knew, consisted of the father who, A conscientious objector on religious grounds had starved to death in the attic of his own house, hidden, some said walled up, there from Confederate provost marshal's men, and fed secretly at night by this same daughter, who at the very time was accumulating her first folio, in which the lost causes unregenerate vanquished were name by name embalmed, and the nephew, who served for 4 years in the same company with his sister's fiancé, and then shot the fiancé to death before the gates to the house where the sister waited in her wedding gown on the eve of the wedding, and then fled, vanished, none knew where. It would be 3 hours yet before he would learn why she had sent for him, because this part of it, this first part of it, Quentin already knew. It was a part of his 20 years' heritage of breathing the same air and hearing his father talk about the man. A part of the town's, Jefferson's, 80 years' heritage of the same air which the man himself had breathed between this September afternoon in 1909 and that Sunday morning in June in 1833, when he first rode into town out of no discernible past, and acquired his land, no one knew how, and built his house, his mansion, apparently out of nothing, and married Ellen Coldfield, and begot his 2 children, the son, who widowed the daughter, who had not yet been a bride, and so accomplished his allotted course to its violent, Miss Coldfield at least would have said just, end. Quentin had grown up with that. The mere names were interchangeable and almost myriad. His childhood was full of them. His very body was an empty hall echoing with sonorous, defeated names. He was not a being, an entity. He was a commonwealth. He was a barracks filled with stubborn, back-looking ghosts still recovering, even 43 years afterward, from the fever which had cured the disease, waking from the fever without even knowing that it had been the fever itself which they had fought against, and not the sickness, looking with stubborn recalcitrance backward beyond the fever and into the disease with actual regret, weak from the fever, yet free of the disease, and not even aware that the freedom was that of impotence. "But why tell me about it?" he said to his father that evening when he returned home, after she had dismissed him at last with his promise to return for her in the buggy. "Why tell me about it? What is it to me that the land or the earth or whatever it was got tired of him at last and turned and destroyed him? What if it did destroy her family, too? It's going to turn and destroy us all some day, whether our name happens to be Sutpen or Coldfield or not." "Ah," Mr. Compson said, "years ago we in the South made our women into ladies. Then the war came and made the ladies into ghosts. So what else can we do, being gentlemen, but listen to them being ghosts?" Then he said, "Do you want to know the real reason why she chose you?" They were sitting on the gallery after supper, waiting for the time Miss Coldfield had set for Quentin to call for her. "It's because she will need someone to go with her, a man, a gentleman, yet one still young enough to do what she wants, do it the way she wants it done. And she chose you because your grandfather was the nearest thing to a friend which Sutpen ever had in this county. And she probably believed that Sutpen may have told your grandfather something about himself and her, about that engagement which did not engage, that troth which failed to plight, might even have told your grandfather the reason why, at the last, she refused to marry him, and that your grandfather might have told me, and I might have told you. And so, in a sense, the affair, no matter what happens out there tonight, will still be in the family. The skeleton, if it be a skeleton, still in the closet. She may believe that if it hadn't been for your grandfather's friendship, Sutpen could never have got a foothold here, and that if he had not got that foothold, he could not have married Ellen. So maybe she considers you partly responsible through heredity for what happened to her and her family through him. Whatever her reason for choosing him, whether it was that or not, the getting to it, Quentin thought, was taking a long time. Meanwhile, as though in inverse ratio to the vanishing voice, the invoked ghost of the man whom she could neither forgive nor revenge herself upon began to assume a quality almost of solidity, permanence, itself circumambient and enclosed by its effluvium of hell, its aura of unregeneration. It mused, thought, seemed to possess sentience, as if, though dispossessed of the peace, who was impervious anyhow to fatigue, which she declined to give it, it was still irrevocably outside the scope of her hurt or harm, with that quality peaceful and now harmless, and not even very attentive, the ogre shape which, as Miss Coldfield's voice went on, resolved out of itself before Quentin's eyes, the two half-ogre children, the three of them forming a shadowy background for the fourth one. This was the mother, the dead sister, Ellen. This Niobe without tears, who had conceived to the demon in a kind of nightmare, who even while alive had moved but without life, and grieved but without weeping, who now had an air of tranquil and unwitting desolation, not as if she had either outlived the others or had died first, but as if she had never lived at all. Quentin seemed to see them, the four of them, arranged into the conventional family group of the period, with formal and lifeless decorum, and seen now as the fading and ancient photograph itself would have been seen, enlarged and hung on the wall, behind and above the voice, and of whose presence there the voice's owner was not even aware, as if she, Miss Coldfield, had never seen this room before, a picture, a group which even to Quentin had a quality strange, contradictory, and bizarre, not quite comprehensible, not even to 20, quite right, a group the last member of which had been dead 25 years, and the first 50, evoked now out of the airless gloom of a dead house between an old woman's grim and implacable unforgiving and the passive chafing of a youth of 20, telling himself even amid the voice, "Maybe you have to know anybody awful well to love them, but when you have hated somebody for 43 years, you will know them awful well, so maybe it's better then, maybe it's fine then, because after 43 years they can't any longer surprise you or make you either very contented or very mad." And maybe it, the voice, the talking, the incredulous and unbearable amazement, had even been a cry aloud once, Quentin thought, long ago when she was a girl, of young and indomitable unregret, of indictment of blind circumstance and savage event, but not now. Now only the lonely, thwarted old female flesh embattled for 43 years in the old insult, the old unforgiving, outraged, and betrayed by the final and complete affront which was Sutpen's death. He wasn't a gentleman. He wasn't even a gentleman. He came here with a horse and 2 pistols, and a name which nobody ever heard before, knew for certain was his own, any more than the horse was his own, or even the pistols, seeking some place to hide himself, and Yoknapatawpha County supplied him with it. He sought the guarantee of reputable men to barricade him from the other and later strangers who might come seeking him in turn, and Jefferson gave him that. Then he needed respectability, the shield of a virtuous woman, to make his position impregnable, even against the men who had given him protection on that inevitable day and hour, when even they must rise against him in scorn and horror and outrage. And it was mine and Ellen's father who gave him that. Oh, I hold no brief for Ellen. Blind, romantic fool, who had only youth and inexperience to excuse her, even if that. Blind, romantic fool, then later blind woman, mother fool, when she no longer had either youth or inexperience to excuse her, when she lay dying in that house for which she had exchanged pride and peace both, and nobody there but the daughter, who was already the same as a widow without ever having been a bride, and was 3 years later to be a widow sure enough, without having been anything at all, and the son who had repudiated the very roof under which he had been born, and to which he would return but once more before disappearing for good, and that as a murderer and almost a fratricide, and he, fiend, blackguard, and devil, in Virginia, fighting, where the chances of the earth's being rid of him were the best anywhere under the sun, yet Ellen and I both knowing that he would return, that every man in our armies would have to fall before bullet or ball found him, and only I, a child, mind you, 4 years younger than the very niece I was asked to save, for Ellen to turn to and say, protect her, protect Judith at least. Yes, blind, romantic fool, who did not even have that 100 miles of plantation which apparently moved our father, nor that big house, and the notion of slaves underfoot day and night, which reconciled, I won't say moved, her aunt. No, just the face of a man who contrived somehow to swagger even on a horse. A man who, so far as anyone, including the father who was to give him a daughter in marriage, knew, either had no past at all, or did not dare reveal it. A man who rode into town out of nowhere with a horse and 2 pistols and a herd of wild beasts that he had hunted down single-handed because he was stronger in fear than even they were in whatever heathen place he had fled from, and that French architect who looked like he had been hunted down and caught in turn by the Negroes. A man who fled here and hid, concealed himself behind respectability, behind that 100 miles of land which he took from a tribe of ignorant Indians, nobody knows how, and a house the size of a courthouse where he lived for 3 years without a window or door or bedstead in it, and still called it Sutpen's 100, as if it had been a king's grant in unbroken perpetuity from his great-grandfather. A home, position, a wife and family, which, being necessary to concealment, he accepted along with the rest of respectability, as he would have accepted the necessary discomfort and even pain of the briars and thorns in a thicket, if the thicket could have given him the protection he sought. No, not even a gentleman. Marrying Ellen, or marrying 10,000 Ellens, could not have made him one. Not that he wanted to be one, or even be taken for one, no. That was not necessary, since all he would need would be Ellen's and our father's names on a wedding license, or on any other patent of respectability that people could look at and read, just as he would have wanted our father's or any other reputable man's signature on a note of hand, because our father knew who his father was in Tennessee, and who his grandfather had been in Virginia, and our neighbors and the people we lived among knew that we knew, and we knew they knew we knew, and we knew that they would have believed us about who and where we came from, even if we had lied, just as anyone could have looked at him once and known that he would be lying about who and where and why he came from, by the very fact that apparently he had to refuse to say at all, and the very fact that he had had to choose respectability to hide behind was proof enough, if anyone needed further proof, that what he fled from must have been some opposite of respectability too dark to talk about, because he was too young.
He was just 25, and a man of 25 does not voluntarily undertake the hardship and privation of clearing virgin land and establishing a plantation in a new country just for money. Not a young man without any past that he apparently cared to discuss. In Mississippi, in 1833, with a river full of steamboats loaded with drunken fools covered with diamonds and bent on throwing away their cotton and slaves before the boat reached New Orleans. Not with this, just one night's hard ride away, and the only handicap or obstacle being the other blackguards, or the risk of being put ashore on a sandbar, and at the remotest a hemp rope. And he was no younger son sent out from some old quiet country like Virginia or Carolina with the surplus Negroes to take up new land, because anybody could look at those Negroes of his and tell that they may have come, and probably did, from a much older country than Virginia or Carolina. But it wasn't a quiet one. And anyone could have looked once at his face and known that he would have chosen the river, and even the certainty of the hemp rope to undertaking what he undertook, even if he had known that he would find gold buried and waiting for him in the very land which he had bought. No, I hold no more brief for Ellen than I do for myself. I hold even less for myself, because I had had 20 years in which to watch him, where Ellen had had but 5. And not even those 5 to see him, but only to hear at second hand what he was doing, and not even to hear more than half of that, since apparently half of what he actually did during those 5 years nobody at all knew about, and half of the remainder no man would have repeated to a wife, let alone a young girl. He came here and set up a raree show which lasted 5 years, and Jefferson paid him for the entertainment by at least shielding him to the extent of not telling their women folks what he was doing. But I had had all my life to watch him in, since apparently, and for what reason heaven has not seen fit to divulge, my life was destined to end on an afternoon in April 43 years ago, since anyone who even had as little to call living as I had had up to that time would not call what I have had since living. I saw what had happened to Ellen, my sister. I saw her almost a recluse, watching those 2 doomed children growing up whom she was helpless to save. I saw the price which she had paid for that house and that pride. I saw the notes of hand on pride and contentment and peace, and all to which she had put her signature when she walked into the church that night begin to fall due in succession. I saw Judith's marriage forbidden without rhyme or reason or shadow of excuse. I saw Ellen die with only me, a child, to turn to and ask to protect her remaining child. I saw Henry repudiate his home and birthright, and then return and practically fling the bloody corpse of his sister's sweetheart at the hem of her wedding gown. I saw that man return, the evil's source and head which had outlasted all its victims, who had created 2 children, not only to destroy one another and his own line, but my line as well. Yet I agreed to marry him. No, I hold no brief for myself. I don't plead youth, since what creature in the South since 1861, man, woman, nigger, or mule, had had time or opportunity not only to have been young, but to have heard what being young was like from those who had. I don't plead propinquity, the fact that I, a woman young and at the age for marrying, and in a time when most of the young men whom I would have known ordinarily were dead on lost battlefields, that I lived for 2 years under the same roof with him. I don't plead material necessity, The fact that an orphan, a woman, and a pauper I turned naturally not for protection, but for actual food to my only kin, my dead sister's family, though I defy anyone to blame me, an orphan of 20, a young woman without resources, who should desire not only to justify her situation, but to vindicate the honor of a family, the good name of whose women has never been impugned, by accepting the honorable proffer of marriage from the man whose food she was forced to subsist on. And most of all, I do not plead myself, a young woman emerging from a holocaust which had taken parents, security, and all from her, who had seen all that living meant to her fall into ruins about the feet of a few figures, with the shapes of men, but with the names and statures of heroes. A young woman, I say, thrown into daily and hourly contact with one of these men who, despite what he might have been at one time, and despite what she might have believed or even known about him, had fought for 4 honorable years for the soil and traditions of the land where she had been born, and the man who had done that, villain died though he be, would have possessed in her eyes, even if only from association with them, the stature and shape of a hero too. And now he also, emerging from the same holocaust in which she had suffered, with nothing to face what the future held for the South but his bare hands and the sword which he at least had never surrendered, and the citation for valor from his defeated commander-in-chief. Oh, he was brave, I have never gainsaid that, but that our cause, our very life and future hopes and past pride should have been thrown into the balance with men like that to buttress it. Men with valor and strength, but without pity or honor. Is it any wonder that heaven saw fit to let us lose?
"No'm," Quentin said.
But that it should have been our father, mine and Ellen's father of them all that he knew, out of all the ones who used to go there and drink and gamble with him, and watch him fight those wild Negroes, whose daughters he might even have won at cards, that it should have been our father. How could he have approached Papa? On what grounds? What could there have been beside the common civility of 2 men meeting on the street, between a man who came from nowhere, or dared not tell where, and our father? What there could have been between a man like that and Papa, a Methodist steward, a merchant who was not rich, and who not only could have done nothing under the sun to advance his fortunes or prospects, but could by no stretch of the imagination even have owned anything that he would have wanted, even picked up in the road, a man who owned neither land nor slaves except 2 house servants whom he had freed as soon as he got them, bought them, who neither drank nor hunted nor gambled. What could there have been between a man who, to my certain knowledge, was never in a Jefferson church but 3 times in his life? The once when he first saw Ellen, the once when they rehearsed the wedding, the once when they performed it. A man that anyone could look at and see that, even if he apparently had none now, he was accustomed to having money and intended to have it again, and would have no scruples about how he got it. That man to discover Ellen inside a church. In church, mind you, as though there were a fatality and curse on our family, and God himself was seeing to it that it was performed and discharged to the last drop and dreg. Yes, fatality and curse on the South and on our family, as though because some ancestor of ours had elected to establish his descent in a land primed for fatality and already cursed with it. Even if it had not rather been our family, our father's progenitors, who had incurred the curse long years before, and had been coerced by heaven into establishing itself in the land and the time already cursed, so that even I, a child still too young to know more than that, though Ellen was my own sister, and Henry and Judith my own nephew and niece, I was not even to go out there, save when Papa or my aunt was with me, and that I was not to play with Henry and Judith at all, except in the house, and not because I was 4 years younger than Judith and 6 years younger than Henry. Wasn't it to me that Ellen turned before she died and said, "Protect them"? Even I used to wonder what our father or his father could have done before he married our mother, that Ellen and I would have to expiate, and neither of us alone be sufficient. What crime committed that would leave our family cursed to be instruments not only for that man's destruction, but for our own? "Yes'm," Quentin said. "Yes," the grim, quiet voice said from beyond the unmoving triangle of dim lace. And now, among the musing and decorous wraiths, Quentin seemed to watch resolving the figure of a little girl in the prim skirts and pantalettes, the smooth, prim, decorous braids of the dead time. She seemed to stand, to lurk, behind the neat picket fence of a small, grimly middle-class yard or lawn, looking out upon the whatever ogre world of that quiet village street, with that air of children born too late into their parents' lives, and doomed to contemplate all human behavior through the complex and needless follies of adults. An air Cassandra-like and humorless and profoundly and sternly prophetic out of all proportion to the actual years even of a child who had never been young. Because I was born too late. I was born 22 years too late. A child to whom, out of the overheard talk of adults, my own sisters and my sisters' children's faces had come to be like the faces in an ogre tale between supper and bed, long before I was old enough or big enough to be permitted to play with them, yet to whom that sister must have to turn at the last when she lay dying, with one of the children vanished and doomed to be a murderer, and the other doomed to be a widow before she had even been a bride, and say, "Protect her, at least save Judith." A child, yet whose child's vouchsafed instinct could make that reply which the mature wisdom of her elders apparently could not make. Protect her? From whom and from what? He has already given them life. He does not need to harm them further. It is from themselves that they need protection. It should have been later than it was. It should have been late. Yet the yellow sashes of mote palpitant sunlight were latticed no higher up the impalpable wall of gloom which separated them. The sun seemed hardly to have moved. It, the talking, the telling, seemed to him, to Quentin, to partake of that logic and reason-flouting quality of a dream which the sleeper knows must have occurred, stillborn and complete, in a second, yet the very quality upon which it must depend to move the dreamer, verisimilitude, to credulity, horror or pleasure or amazement, depends as completely upon a formal recognition of and acceptance of elapsed and yet elapsing time as music or a printed tale. Yes, I was born too late. I was a child who was to remember those three faces, and his, too, as seen for the first time in the carriage on that first Sunday morning, when this town finally realized that he had turned that road from Sutpen's 100 into the church into a racetrack. I was 3 then, and doubtless I had seen them before. I must have. But I do not remember it. I do not even remember ever having seen Ellen before that Sunday. It was as though the sister whom I had never laid eyes on, who before I was born had vanished into the stronghold of an ogre or a djinn, was now to return through a dispensation of 1 day only to the world which she had quitted. And I, a child of 3, waked early for the occasion, dressed and curled as if for Christmas, for an occasion more serious than Christmas even, since now and at last this ogre or djinn had agreed for the sake of the wife and the children to come to church, to permit them at least to approach the vicinity of salvation, to at least give Ellen 1 chance to struggle with him for those children's souls on a battleground where she could be supported not only by heaven, but by her own family and people of her own kind. Yes, even for the moment submitting himself to redemption, or, lacking that, at least chivalrous for the instant, even though still unregenerate. That is what I expected. This is what I saw as I stood there before the church, between Papa and our aunt, and waited for the carriage to arrive from the 12-mile drive. And though I must have seen Ellen and the children before this is the vision of my first sight of them, which I shall carry to my grave. A glimpse like the forefront of a tornado, of the carriage and Ellen's high white face within it, and the 2 replicas of his face in miniature flanking her, and on the front seat the face and teeth of the wild Negro who was driving, and his face exactly like the Negro's, save for the teeth, this because of his beard, doubtless, all in a thunder and a fury of wild-eyed horses, and of galloping, and of dust. Oh, there were plenty of them to abet him, assist him, make a race of it. 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, the carriage racing on 2 wheels up to the very door of the church, with that wild Negro in his Christian clothes looking exactly like a performing tiger in a linen duster and a top hat, and Ellen with no drop of blood in her face, holding those 2 children who were not crying and who did not need to be held, who sat on either side of her perfectly still, too, with in their faces that infantile enormity which we did not then quite comprehend. Oh, yes, there were plenty to aid and abet him. Even he could not have held a horse race without someone to race against, because it was not even public opinion that stopped him, not even the men who might have had wives and children in carriages to be ridden down and into ditches. It was the minister himself speaking in the name of the women of Jefferson and Yoknapatawpha County. So he quit coming to church himself. Now it would be just Ellen and the children in the carriage on Sunday morning, so we knew now that at least there would be no betting now, since no one could say if it was an actual race or not, since now, with his face absent, it was only the wild Negro's perfectly inscrutable one, with the teeth glinting a little, so that now we could never know if it were a race or a runaway, and if there was triumph, it was on the face 12 miles back there at Sutpens 100, which did not even require to see or be present. It was the Negro now who, in the act of passing another carriage, spoke to that team too, as well as to his own, something without words, not needing words probably, in that tongue in which they slept in the mud of that swamp and brought here out of whatever dark swamp he had found them in and brought them here. The dust, the thunder, the carriage whirling up to the church door, while women and children scattered and screamed before it, and men caught at the bridles of the other team. And the Negro would let Ellen and the children out at the door, and take the carriage on around to the hitching groove and beat the horses for running away. There was even a fool who tried to interfere once, whereupon the Negro turned upon him with the stick lifted and his teeth showing a little, and said, "Master say I do. You tell master." Yes, from themselves. And this time it was not even the minister. It was Ellen. Our aunt and Papa were talking, and I came in, and my aunt said, "Go out and play." Though even if I could not have heard through the door at all, I could have repeated the conversation for them. "Your daughter, your own daughter," my aunt said, and Papa, "Yes, she is my daughter. When she wants me to interfere, she will tell me so herself." Because this Sunday, when Ellen and the children came out of the front door, it was not the carriage waiting, it was Ellen's phaeton with the old gentle mare which she drove, and the stable boy that he had bought instead of the wild Negro. And Judith looked once at the phaeton and realized what it meant and began to scream, screaming and kicking while they carried her back into the house and put her to bed. No, he was not present, nor do I claim a lurking, triumphant face behind a window curtain. Probably he would have been as amazed as we were, since we would all realize now that we were faced by more than a child's tantrum or even hysteria, that his face had been in that carriage all the time, that it had been Judith, a girl of 6, who had instigated and authorized that Negro to make the team run away. Not Henry, mind, not the boy, which would have been outrageous enough, but Judith, the girl. As soon as Papa and I entered those gates that afternoon and began to go up the drive toward the house, I could feel it. It was as though somewhere in that Sunday afternoon's quiet and peace the screams of that child still existed, lingered, not as sound now, but as something for the skin to hear, the hair on the head to hear. But I did not ask at once. I was just 4 then. I sat in the buggy beside Papa as I had stood between him and our aunt before the church on that first Sunday when I had been dressed to come and see my sister and my nephew and niece for the first time, looking at the house. I had been inside it before, too, of course, but even when I saw it for the first time that I could remember, I seemed already to know how it was going to look, just as I seemed to know how Ellen and Judith and Henry would look before I saw them for the first time, which I always remember as being the first. No, not asking even then, but just looking at that huge, quiet house, saying, "What room is Judith sick in, Papa?" with that quiet aptitude of a child for accepting the inexplicable, though I now know that even then I was wondering what Judith saw when she came out the door and found the phaeton instead of the carriage, the tame stable boy instead of the wild man, what she had seen in that phaeton which looked so innocent to the rest of us, or worse, what she had missed when she saw the phaeton and began to scream. Yes, a still, hot, quiet Sunday afternoon like this afternoon. I remember yet the utter quiet of that house when we went in, and from which I knew at once that he was absent without knowing that he would now be in the Scuppernong arbor, drinking with Wash Jones. I only knew, as soon as Papa and I crossed the threshold, that he was not there, as though with some almost omniscient conviction, that same instinctive knowledge which enabled me to tell Ellen that it was not from him that Judith would need protection, knowing that he did not need to stay and observe his triumph, and that in comparison with what was to be, this one was a mere trivial business, even beneath our notice, too. Yet that quiet, darkened room with the blinds closed and a Negro woman sitting beside the bed with a fan, and Judith's white face on the pillow beneath a camphor cloth, asleep, as I supposed then. Possibly it was sleep, or would be called sleep. And Ellen's face, white and calm, and Papa said, "Go out and find Henry and ask him to play with you, Rosa." And so I stood just outside that quiet door in that quiet upper hall because I was afraid to go away even from it, because I could hear the Sabbath afternoon quiet of that house louder than thunder, louder than laughing even with triumph. "Think of the children," Papa said. "Think?" Ellen said. "What else do I do? What else do I lie awake at night and do but think of them?" Neither Papa nor Ellen said, "Come back home." No. This occurred before it became fashionable to repair your mistakes by turning your back on them and running. It was just the two quiet voices beyond that blank door which might have been discussing something printed in a magazine, and I, a child, standing close beside that door because I was afraid to be there but more afraid to leave it, standing motionless beside that door as though trying to make myself blend with the dark wood and become invisible like a chameleon, listening to the living spirit, presence of that house, since some of Ellen's life and breath had now gone into it as well as his, breathing away in a long, neutral sound of victory and despair, of triumph and terror, too. "Do you love this?" Papa said. "Papa," Ellen said. That was all, but I could see her face then as clearly as Papa could have, with that same expression which it had worn in the carriage on that first Sunday and the others. Then a servant came and said our buggy was ready. Yes, from themselves, not from him, not from anybody, just as nobody could have saved them, even himself, because he now showed us why that triumph had been beneath his notice. He showed Ellen, that is, not I. I was not there. It was 6 years now, during which I had scarcely seen him. Our aunt was gone now, and I was keeping house for Papa. Perhaps once a year Papa and I would go out there and have dinner, and maybe 4 times a year Ellen and the children would come in and spend the day with us. Not he. That I know of. He never entered this house again after he and Ellen married. I was young then. I was even young enough to believe that this was due to some stubborn coal of conscience, if not remorse, even in him. But I know better now. I know now that it was simply because, since Papa had given him respectability through a wife, there was nothing else he could want from Papa, and so not even sheer gratitude, let alone appearances, could force him to forego his own pleasure to the extent of taking a family meal with his wife's family. So I saw little of them. I did not have time now to play, even if I had ever had any inclination. I had never learned how, and I saw no reason to try to learn now, even if I had had the time. So it was 6 years now, though it was actually no secret to Ellen, since it had apparently been going on ever since he drove the last nail in the house, the only difference between now and the time of his bachelorhood being that now they would hitch the teams and saddle horses and mules in the grove beyond the stable, and so come up across the pasture unseen from the house, because there were plenty of them still. It was as if God or the devil had taken advantage of his very vices in order to supply witnesses to the discharge of our curse, not only from among gentlefolks, our own kind, but from the very scum and riffraff, who could not have approached the house itself under any other circumstances, not even from the rear. Yes, Ellen and those 2 children alone in that house, 12 miles from town, and down there in the stable, a hollow square of faces in the lantern light, the white faces on 3 sides, the black ones on the 4th, and in the center 2 of his wild Negroes fighting, naked, fighting not like white men fight, with rules and weapons, but like Negroes fight, to hurt one another quick and bad. Ellen knew that, or thought she did. That was not it. She accepted that, not reconciled, accepted. as though there is a breathing point in outrage where you can accept it almost with gratitude, since you can say to yourself, "Thank God, this is all. At least I now know all of it." Thinking that, clinging still to that, when she ran into the stable that night, while the very men who had stolen into it from the rear fell back away from her with at least some grain of decency. And Ellen, seeing not the two black beasts she had expected to see, but instead a white one and a black one, both naked to the waist, and gouging at one another's eyes as if their skins should not only have been the same color, but should have been covered with fur, too. Yes, it seems that on certain occasions, perhaps at the end of the evening, the spectacle, as a grand finale, or perhaps as a matter of sheer deadly forethought toward the retention of supremacy, domination, he would enter the ring with one of the Negroes himself. Yes, that is what Ellen saw. Her husband and the father of her children standing there naked and panting and bloody to the waist, and the Negro just fallen, evidently, lying at his feet and bloody too, save that on the Negro it merely looked like grease or sweat. Ellen running down the hill from the house, bareheaded, in time to hear the sound, the screaming, hearing it while she still ran in the darkness, and before the spectators knew that she was there, hearing it even before it occurred to one spectator to say, "It's a horse," then, "It's a woman," then, "My God, it's a child," ran in, and the spectators falling back to permit her to see Henry plunge out from among the Negroes who had been holding him, screaming and vomiting, not pausing, not even looking at the faces which shrank back away from her as she knelt in the stable filth to raise Henry, and not looking at Henry either, but up at him as he stood there with even his teeth showing beneath his beard now, and another Negro wiping the blood from his body with a toe-sack. "I know you will excuse us, gentlemen," Ellen said. But they were already departing, nigger and white, slinking out again as they had slunk in, and Ellen not watching them now either, but kneeling in the dirt, while Henry clung to her, crying, and he standing there yet, while a third nigger prodded his shirt or coat at him, as though the coat were a stick, and he a caged snake. "Where is Judith, Thomas?" Ellen said. "Judith," he said. Oh, he was not lying. His own triumph had outrun him. He had builded even better in evil than he could have hoped. "Judith? Isn't she in bed?" "Don't lie to me, Thomas," Ellen said. "I can understand your bringing Henry here to see this, wanting Henry to see this. I will try to understand it. Yes, I will make myself try to understand it. But not Judith, Thomas. Not my baby girl, Thomas." "I don't expect you to understand it," he said, "because you are a woman. But I didn't bring Judith down here. I would not bring her down here. I don't expect you to believe that, but I swear it to you." "I wish I could believe you," Ellen said. "I want to believe you." Then she began to call. "Judith!" she called in a voice calm and sweet and filled with despair. "Judith, honey! Time to come to bed." But I was not there. I was not there to see the two Sutpen faces this time, once on Judith and once on the Negro girl beside her, looking down through the square entrance to the loft. Chapter 2. It was a summer of wisteria. The twilight was full of it, and the smell of his father's cigar, as they sat on the front gallery after supper until it would be time for Quentin to start, while in the deep shaggy lawn below the veranda the fireflies blew and drifted in soft random, the odor, the scent which 5 months later Mr. Compson's letter would carry up from Mississippi, and over the long iron New England snow, and into Quentin's sitting room at Harvard.
It was a day of listening, too. The hearing in 1909 even, yet mostly that which he already knew, since he had been born in and still breathed the same air in which the church bells had rung on that Sunday morning in 1833,
and on Sundays heard even one of the original 3 bells in the same steeple where descendants of the same pigeons strutted and crooned, or wheeled in short courses resembling soft fluid paint smears on the soft summer sky. A Sunday morning in June, with the bells ringing, peaceful and peremptory and a little cacophonous, the denominations in concord, though not in tune, and the ladies and children and house negroes to carry the parasols and fly whisks, and even a few men, the ladies moving in hoops among the miniature broadcloth of little boys and the pantalettes of little girls, in the skirts of the time when ladies did not walk, but floated, when the other men, sitting with their feet on the railing of the Holston House gallery, looked up, and there the stranger was. He was already halfway across the square when they saw him on a big, hard-ridden roan horse, man and beast looking as though they had been created out of thin air and set down in the bright summer Sabbath sunshine in the middle of a tired foxtrot. Face and horse that none of them had ever seen before, name that none of them had ever heard, and origin and purpose which some of them were never to learn. So that in the next 4 weeks, Jefferson was a village then, the Holston House, the courthouse, 6 stores, a blacksmith and livery stable, a saloon frequented by drovers and peddlers, 3 churches, and perhaps 30 residences, the stranger's name went back and forth among the places of business and of idleness, and among the residences, in steady strophe and antistrophe. Sutpen, 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 Sutpen. This was all that the town was to know about him for almost a month. He had apparently come into town from the South, a man of about 25, as the town learned later, because at the time his age could not have been guessed, because at that time he looked like a man who had been sick, not like a man who had been peacefully ill in bed and had recovered, to move with a sort of diffident and tentative amazement in a world which he believed himself on the point of surrendering, but like a man who had been through some solitary furnace experience, which was more than just fever, like an explorer, say, who not only had to face the normal hardship of the pursuit which he chose, but was overtaken by the added and unforeseen handicap of the fever also, and fought through it at enormous cost, not so much physical as mental, alone and unaided, and not through blind instinctive will to endure and survive, but to gain and keep to enjoy it the material prize for which he accepted the original gambit. A man with a big frame, but gaunt now almost to emaciation, with a short reddish beard which resembled a disguise, and above which his pale eyes had a quality at once visionary and alert, ruthless and reposed in a face whose flesh had the appearance of pottery, of having been colored by that oven's fever, either of soul or environment, deeper than sun, alone beneath a dead, impervious surface, as of glazed clay. That was what they saw, though it was years before the town learned that that was all which he possessed at the time, the strong, spent horse and the clothes on his back and a small saddle-bag scarcely large enough to contain the spare linen and the razors, and the 2 pistols of which Miss Coldfield told Quentin, with the butts worn smooth as pick-handles, and which he used with the precision of knitting needles. Later, Quentin's grandfather saw him ride at a canter around a sapling at 20 feet, and put both bullets into a playing card fastened to the tree. He had a room in the Holston House, but he carried the key with him, and each morning he fed and saddled the horse, and rode away before daylight, where, too, the town likewise failed to learn, probably due to the fact that he gave the pistol demonstration on the third day after his arrival. So they had to depend on inquiry to find out what they could about him, which would of necessity be at night, at the supper table in the Holston House dining room, or in the lounge, which he would have to cross to gain his room and lock the door again, which he would do as soon as he finished eating. The bar opened into the lounge, too, and that would or should have been the place to accost him and even inquire, except for the fact that he did not use the bar. He did not drink at all, he told them. He did not say that he used to drink and had quit, nor that he had never used alcohol. He just said that he would not care for a drink. It was years later before even Quentin's grandfather, he was a young man too then, it would be years yet before he would become General Compson, learned that the reason Sutpen did not drink was that he did not have the money with which to pay his share or return the courtesy. It was General Compson who first realized that at this time Sutpen lacked not only the money to spend for drink and conviviality, but the time and inclination as well, that he was at this time completely the slave of his secret and furious impatience, his conviction gained from whatever that recent experience had been, that fever, mental or physical, of a need for haste, of time fleeing beneath him, which was to drive him for the next 5 years, as General Compson computed it, roughly until about 9 months before his son was born. So they would catch him, run him to earth in the lounge between the supper table and his locked door to give him the opportunity to tell them who he was, and where he came from, and what he was up to, whereupon he would move gradually and steadily until his back came in contact with something, a post or a wall, and then stand there and tell them nothing whatever, as pleasantly and courteously as a hotel clerk. It was the Chickasaw Indian agent with or through whom he dealt, and so it was not until he waked the county recorder that Saturday night with the deed, patent to the land and the gold Spanish coin that the town learned that he now owned 100 square miles of some of the best virgin bottomland in the country, though even that knowledge came too late, because Sutpen himself was gone, where to, again, they did not know. But he owned land among them now, and some of them began to suspect what General Compson apparently knew, that the Spanish coin with which he had paid to have his patent recorded was the last one of any kind which he possessed. So they were certain now that he had departed to get more. There were several who even anticipated in believing, and even in saying aloud, now that he was not present, what Sutpen's future and then unborn sister-in-law was to tell Quentin almost 80 years later, that he had found some unique and practical way of hiding loot, and that he had returned to the cache to replenish his pockets, even if he had not actually ridden with the 2 pistols back to the river and the steamboats, full of gamblers and cotton and slave dealers, to replenish the cache. At least some of them were telling one another that when 2 months later he returned, again without warning and accompanied this time by the covered wagon with a Negro driving it, and on the seat with the Negro a small, alertly resigned man with a grim, harried Latin face, in a frock coat and a flowered waistcoat, and a hat which would have created no furor on a Paris boulevard, all of which he was to wear constantly for the next 2 years, the somberly theatric clothing and the expression of fatalistic and amazed determination, while his white client and the Negro crew, which he was to advise, though not direct, went stark naked, save for a coating of dried mud. This was the French architect. Years later, the town learned that he had come all the way from Martinique on Sutpen's bare promise, and lived for 2 years on venison cooked over a campfire, in an unfloored tent made of the wagon hood, before he so much as saw any color or shape of pay, and until he passed through town on his way back to New Orleans 2 years later, he was not even to see Jefferson again. He would not come, or Sutpen would not bring him to town, even on the few occasions when Sutpen would be seen there, and he did not have much chance to look at Jefferson on that first day because the wagon did not stop. Apparently, it was only by sheer geographic hap that Sutpen passed through town at all, pausing only long enough for someone, not General Compson, to look beneath the wagon hood and into a black tunnel filled with still eyeballs and smelling like a wolf den. But the legend of Sutpen's wild Negroes was not to begin at once, because the wagon went on as though even the wood and iron which composed it, as well as the mules which drew it, had become imbued by sheer association with him with the quality of gaunt and tireless driving, that conviction for haste and of fleeing time. Later, Sutpen told Quentin's grandfather that on that afternoon when the wagon passed through Jefferson, they had been without food since the previous night, and that he was trying to reach Sutpen's 100 and the river bottom to try to kill a deer before dark. So he and the architect and the Negroes would not have to spend another night without food. So the legend of the wild men came gradually back to town, brought by the men who would ride out to watch what was going on, who began to tell how Sutpen would take stand beside a game trail with the pistols and send the Negroes in to drive the swamp like a pack of hounds. It was they who told how, during that first summer and fall, the Negroes did not even have or did not use blankets to sleep in. Even before the coon hunter, Akers, claimed to have walked one of them out of the absolute mud like a sleeping alligator and screamed just in time. The Negroes could speak no English yet, and doubtless there were more than Akers who did not know that the language in which they and Sutpen communicated was a sort of French, and not some dark and fatal tongue of their own. There were many more than Akers, though the others were responsible citizens and landowners, and so did not have to lurk about the camp at night. In fact, as Miss Coldfield told Quentin, they would make up parties to meet at the Holston house and go out on horseback, often carrying lunch. Sutpen had built a brick kiln, and he had set up the saw and planer, which he had brought in the wagon, a capstan with a long sapling walking beam, with the wagon team and the Negroes in shifts, and himself too, when necessary, when the machinery slowed, hitched to it, as if the Negroes actually were wild men. As General Compson told his son, Quentin's father, while the Negroes were working, Sutpen never raised his voice at them, that instead he led them, caught them at the psychological instant by example, by some ascendancy of forbearance rather than by brute fear. Without dismounting, usually Sutpen did not even greet them with as much as a nod, apparently as unaware of their presence as if they had been idle shades, they would sit in a curious, quiet clump, as though for mutual protection, and watch his mansion rise, carried plank by plank and brick by brick out of the swamp where the clay and timber waited, the bearded white man and the 20 black ones, and all stark naked beneath the crouching and pervading mud. Being men, these spectators did not realize that the garments which Sutpen had worn when he first rode into Jefferson were the only ones in which they had ever seen him, and few of the women in the county had seen him at all yet. Otherwise, some of them would have anticipated Miss Coldfield in this, too, in divining that he was saving his clothes, since decorum, even if not elegance of appearance, would be the only weapon, or rather ladder, with which he could conduct the last assault upon what Miss Coldfield, and perhaps others, believed to be respectability. That respectability which, according to General Compson, consisted in Sutpen's secret mind of a great deal more than the mere acquisition of a châtelaine for his house. So he and the 20 Negroes worked together, plastered over with mud against the mosquitoes, and, as Miss Coldfield told Quentin, distinguishable one from another by his beard and eyes alone, and only the architect resembling a human creature because of the French clothes which he wore constantly with a sort of invincible fatality until the day after the house was completed, save for the window glass and the ironware, which they could not make by hand, and the architect departed, working in the sun and heat of summer and the mud and ice of winter with quiet and unflagging fury. It took him 2 years, he and his crew of imported slaves, which his adopted fellow citizens still looked on as being a good deal more deadly than any beast he could have started and slain in that country,